So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the WISE debate, which is Rethinking Education and Development. My name is Reeta Roy. I'm the President and CEO of the MasterCard Foundation, and I'm going to serve as the moderator for our panel. Let me take a minute to set up the topic and the framework for our discussion today, and then I will introduce our distinguished panelists. As we know, and as stated at the plenary session, education is the cornerstone of progress, in fact, the cornerstone of all development. And education is intended to empower people, to close those gaps in society, and to increase equity, particularly for people living in poverty. And therefore, education needs to be relevant to all sectors, whether it's healthcare, job creation, the environment, the legal status of different people. Education needs to be relevant to society. Yet in so many countries, as we know, education is not relevant, and learners are not acquiring the skills that they need in order to be productive. This panel will seek to encourage and to explore a new vision of education, and a new vision where education is a contributor to social progress, where we need to ensure that education strategies are also connected and interfacing with economic and social strategies. Now, we will run this panel in the following manner. We will begin with a series of questions for the panelists, which I will moderate, and then we'll open up the session to discussion for the general plenary, and we'll be taking questions from the audience as well as online from the web stream. So let me first begin to introduce our panelists, and one in particular needs no introduction. We are so thrilled to have Sir Fazle Abed, the founder of BRAC and today's Laureate of the WISE Prize, here with us. And as you've heard, Sir Abed leads the world's largest development organization, which serves over 110 million people around the world. And he has been distinguished in many, many ways, including with today's prize. Sitting next to him is Carole Bellamy, who is the chair of the board of directors of the Global Partnership for Education, previously known as the Education for All, the Fast Track Initiative for Education. Carole, too, has had a distinguished career both in private life, in the world of finance, and in public service. And many of you will know her in her role as a leader of UNICEF, and most recently as the CEO of World Learning. Next to Carole is Professor Georges Haddad, who is the Director of Education Research and Foresight in the education sector at UNESCO. He has been a distinguished professor of mathematics for a number of years at many famed universities in France, most notably of the Sorbonne. Professor Haddad is also the author of numerous publications on education and society. So we have a panel who's going to bring a number of wise perspectives on how we integrate education in the area of development. So let's begin. The first question I'm going to pose to everyone here is that if you could imagine the world in 50 years, what kind of economy would we have? What kind of world do we want to see? And what's the role of education in creating the economy and the world of the future? So let's start with Carole.
Thank you very much. Despite the fact that Jeff Sachs said that technology was going to solve everything, I managed to not get these questions from our chair until about half an hour ago or 2 hours ago. So I'll offer some comments. Maybe more toward less on the economies. Maybe in 50 years, the US and European economies may have turned around, but more on skills and what one would be looking for. So I'm going to throw out 3 words: generalist, borderless, and cross-cultural. By generalists, I mean, I think that education systems are going to have to recognize that because of the incredible change that will take place at even increasing speed, that that the capacity to educate, to create the human being who is more of a generalist. Obviously, the person has to have skills. We'll still have need for skills in health and in education and in business and in science, and they won't go away. They may change, but the absolute specialist will need to change so often that they're really going to need to be a generalist. And so in my view, the kind of skills we're talking about there are problem-solving skills, they are critical thinking skills, and they are entrepreneurial skills. I think too little attention is put to entrepreneurial skills, which I think will have to play much more of a role going forward, and probably should have in the past. Borderless. I say borderless because we live already, and we'll live increasingly in a borderless world, whether it's financial borderless, education borderless, or just borderless. That doesn't mean everybody will be moving around. People may not move at all, but the person they're talking to from one moment to the next may not be anywhere near where they are. The teacher they are learning from, the art they are seeing, the business transaction they are engaging with. Physical institutions will become, will in many ways disappear. There'll still be buildings, presumably, that people will go into, but less will be done there and more will be done in, and so we're going to have be skilled more to deal borderless. And my third word, with two words, cross-cultural. To me, global citizens. Our education has to better support a human being who indeed can engage globally. If that and I'm not talking about how many stamps there are in a passport. If that person never whether that person is getting on a plane to go to the Middle East, or that person is getting on their bicycle to go across town, nevertheless, we are all going to have to engage in a much more global world, even if we don't move. And the skills need to do that. The tolerance, the respect, the cross-cultural skills, even language skills to my own country, which is a multilingual country, vastly racing to become monolingual, going in the wrong direction. Even language skills will play a role. So those are my thoughts in terms of what we should be looking at in our education system going forward.
Fantastic. George, how do you see the future?
It's difficult to see the future and to be a soothsayer. And as I am not confident in my English, I've prepared just a short paragraph which represents what I would like to say, especially, and then I will speak directly. School children and students today find it progressively more difficult to see and believe that time passed at school means accumulating cognitive capital for the future. The absence or lack of meaningful portrayals of professions deriving even more from the service or cultural sectors requires such powers of imagination that many young people cannot see their way to devoting time and effort to attaining as yet unidentifiable objectives. The link between education and the trades and professions has been lost, just as stable and well-known occupations have been replaced by an infinite variety of tasks that defy classification and are doomed to an uncertain future. Children still play at being shopkeepers and soldiers, to occupations that will be with us for some time, but we have yet to see them pretending to be engineers, entrepreneurs, researchers, or financial analysts. The number of occupational types has multiplied since the start of the Industrial Revolution, again since the Second World War, and above all, since the advent of the computer age. Education, the prime factor on which the whole show directly or indirectly depends, has to aim not only at all young people, but also at the population as a whole, in the case of continuing, often termed lifelong education, and in so doing, take account of those constraints. I think those represent the challenge of education, not only for today, but for tomorrow. And as Carole said, we need to address inter and pluridisciplinary approach of education, but also keep in mind that we need also specialists. We cannot offer to deliver only this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach of education, but we need engineers who are real engineers, doctors who are real doctors, chemists who are chemists, mathematicians who are mathematicians, but also give a supplement of soul to education today beyond school system. Education is not only related to school system, it's all over life, all over lifelong learning education at school, at home, in industry, in companies, through medias. And I think that we have to think how to give, as a French philosopher used to say, a supplement of soul to our education system and education challenges.
Very beautiful. Supplement to the soul.
I agree with both my fellow presenters before me. I think in next 50 years, there's going to be a tremendous change in terms of the education, the way we provide education to our children. Firstly, I don't think we will provide school education the way we have organized school systems and college systems. They will probably disappear in 50 years. There will be learning centers, whether they're at home or in clubs or other social forums. Learning would be done through other processes, not necessarily teacher teaching a class. What I agreed totally with Jeffrey Sachs this morning's comments. He said that the ICT, the information technology that we now have in our fingertips, and the way it's developing, the best educational opportunity could be provided to the remotest corner of the earth without paying much for it. So children in the remote villages getting the best teacher teaching a class in Bangladesh, in Bangla maybe, or if he's learning in English, best teacher at the best school in the United States or France should be able to teach that class, because it will be available through internet to any remotest corner of the earth. So I see educational processes becoming available, the best of the classes available to everybody. So there will be a kind of, in 50 years, the learning opportunities will open up for everybody, the poor, rich, everybody. So that's one area that I see a wonderful opportunity, which didn't exist for poor countries before. We always worried about how to train our teachers. Are they competent enough? Are they supervised well? All kinds of things will go, and new opportunities will come with new kind of challenges of seeing that the best education takes place, children learn and operate effectively, they are socialized properly, all kinds of areas like that. Now, I'd like to tell a story about education and the way it is played over the last few centuries. I was getting an honorary degree from a Canadian university called Queen's University in Canada, and in my class, or the degree giving occasion, I had another person getting a degree in history, and he did a study of 16th century European institutions and looked at 500 16th century European institutions and found only 33 survive today. What are these 33 institutions which survived from 16th century Europe? He found 29 of them are universities, 2 churches, 1 parliament, and 1 business. What are these 29 universities? It's Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Sorbonne, Uppsala, Leiden, Heidelberg. These are the universities which, so why universities survive over centuries and businesses don't? He speculated that maybe universities created leaders and all societies needed leaders, or universities have been able to respond to the evolving needs of societies in a way that others didn't, and that's why they survived. So education has had a long desire. Most countries desired good education, good leaders for their leaders anyway. But nowadays we want good citizens, not just leaders. We want our citizens to be well educated so that they can perform better in the world, in the globalized economy. So it is a democratic education that we want, or education is democratized. We want all our children to be educated well and perform well, and perform in the global arena as well as everybody else. So that's what the challenge is for the next 50 years. And I don't want to speculate too much as to what is going to happen in the next 50 years in terms of technology, climate change and all that. But I can see, for example, the entire Siberian ices, the snow is going to melt away. There'll be tremendous, huge prairie of where you can produce lots of food for everybody. So one sees problems of climate change, but also process of climate change too. So I think the world will somehow or other deal with all these situations quite well. I'm hopeful that things will handle it well.
No doubt. So while we have you here as our laureate, I want to take a special advantage to say, if you think back, with 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you had to help pioneer an education system for what is Bangladesh today. How did you conceptualize that? How did you think about the values which we need to live by? And how did you embed that into education? So what's the lesson from Bangladesh?
Right. Well, 30 years ago, I started designing a primary education program for Bangladeshi children. So, I looked at which countries are doing well in what. Maths, it's Holland, Netherlands teaches their maths best for their 14-year-olds. They are also very good in teaching languages. Then you find Italians, they do excellently for preschool education. The Japanese do very well in science education for their children. Germany, they do a much better job with educational management. They get more out of their teachers and children during the school time. And then you have Sweden provides high quality education for adults. In other words, if you, at the age of 50, you want to learn philosophy again, you can go to a night college and learn it. The adult education is available in Sweden. But the other thing was New Zealand. New Zealand teaches their children, their mother tongue, most efficiently. Apparently they can read and write at the age of 4, and then they learn faster. So I sent one of my staff to see the New Zealand ambassador to Delhi. He was Sir Edmund Hillary, the Everest, conqueror of Everest.
Delhi,
so Hillary says, yes, I'll get you a couple of teachers from New Zealand and you can come and help you in designing curriculum for teaching learning.
Et il est venu m'aider à mettre en place ce système d'éducation. Et donc j'ai demandé à des professeurs de mathématiques des Pays-Bas et de Grande-Bretagne venir m'aider à mettre en place un système éducatif primaire pour les enfants pauvres du Bangladesh qui néanmoins, à mon avis, méritaient le meilleur de l'éducation. Et puis je me suis dit qu'il fallait que je parle.
فما هو نوع المجتمع المجتمع الذي نريد أن نخلقه؟ ما هي المجتمعات التي نحن بحاجة إليها؟ نحن بحاجة إلى مجتمعات من نوع معين. ما هو الشيء المتوفر في بنغلاديش؟ فلا بد أولا من أن نفهم القدرات المتوفرة وكيفية
So, and then I asked a group of artists to come in and say that, tell me what kind of society you want to build in Bangladesh. One artist said, you have to teach them how to do art in primary school. So I said, well, these are for the poorest children. I can't give them all kinds of crayons and paper to do art. He said, no, we don't have to do that. You need to tell them how to observe things. The artists observe things, and the observation is the one thing that you have to teach your children. So I said, well, how do you want me to do it? So he said, you ask your teacher to take the children out or give them a task. What's the task? The task is going to be, look at how a frog jumps into a pond. And I want you to look at that, observe that well, and then tomorrow I'm going to ask you to draw it. The hind legs and the forelegs. What happens to the legs, forelegs when he jumps, and when he gets into the water, what shape does it take? So the teachers, so the teacher gives them this kind of exercise. So the children learn how to observe things. Give them exercise from nature. Look at leaves, what are the shapes of leaves. Ask them to come and draw, things like that. So you don't have to spend a lot of money to teach observation. So he was one of those very unusual person who thought that I should do that. So we have collected a lot of people's advice and counsel to try and get the best curriculum materials and methodology of teaching learning in our schools. So that was one thing. The other thing that I wanted to say about the problems we have in Bangladesh, trying to feed our people. We have 160 million people and landmass very small, and we have to produce enough food to feed them. Now, a report came out in 1990. It said, by UNDP, it said that Bangladesh's agriculture has reached its peak. Why? Because the level of education of farmers, it cannot go any further. If you have to take your agriculture further, you have to educate your farmers better. And I understood it very well because I went to Japan the year before, and the Japanese rice farmer, I was passing through some rice farms in Japan, and the rice farmers, his name was Hiroshi. And I said to Hiroshi, how is your farm, how is your rice crop this year? He said, well, it's not very good because I should have 19 ratoons, 19 shoots coming out of each plant, but I've got only 13. And because I went to my sister's wedding for 19 days, and my mother wouldn't let me come out. And there was this plot didn't get enough water and fertilizer at the right time. That's why he got less. So this farmer could quantify, evaluate, monitor what was happening to his plot. But if you ask a Bangladeshi farmer, he says, Allah is giving me good crop. He doesn't quantify, he doesn't monitor, he doesn't, so he doesn't have the education to get the best crop. That's what it means. So when you say that farmers need to be educated, it doesn't mean that he needs to be educated in agriculture. He needs to be educated in how to measure progress. That's what it means. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories. There's a lot of wisdom in those stories. To take Sir Abed's comment a moment ago further, that universities, even though learning systems will change over the next 50 years, but it's likely that universities will endure. And they, in many ways, are the backbone of a learning society. But one of the paradoxes of living in Carole's borderless, global, generalist world is while we learn, we also need to question what we learn. And so it's that balance. I know, Georges, you like to write about rationality and creativity. How do we educate a society, Georges, to think and to question the fundamentals of what we learn?
This is the most fundamental question. Sorry, this is the most fundamental question. And as a mathematical teacher, I've always thought that my goal and my objective teaching to children and to students is to give them what I call the two fundamental aspects of approach to knowledge based on desire and doubt as driving forces for creativity and rationality. I don't try to impose them knowledge as something which is done for life, etc. But I want to create and to develop in their mind this capacity to be critical, to be rational, to be creative, to be innovative. And that's the role of education. Education is not to impose a knowledge as done for life, etc., because knowledge evolves. It's a dynamic process. What we considered as granted 20 years ago is completely transformed today. So I think that we have to be modest, humble, and ambitious in this aspect of delivering knowledge. You mentioned technology. Of course, Jeffrey Sachs mentioned technology, but Sheikh Hamza said something which is more important. Why? Because technology now, and tomorrow surely, will make all knowledge and basic knowledge available to everyone, everywhere. But the question is, what should we learn? What should we retain? How do we develop our critical ability not to take all this knowledge as granted, but we have to have this citizen dimension, to have a critical aspect. This is why we need teachers, we need schools, but we need also to make education a dynamic process through life. And this is why also it's important to create this rational vision of education and to create and to develop this doubt with desire to learn, but doubt also not to receive everything as granted for life. And just to finish about university, you mentioned university. I would like to speak on my university, not to promote Sorbonne University, but because Sorbonne University send a message few people know. And if you ask even French professors at university, why Sorbonne is called Sorbonne? Sorbonne was founded centuries ago, during the Middle Ages, by a scholar called Robert de Sorbonne. Robert de Sorbonne, who founded the first Royal College of Paris, supported by King St. Louis. Okay. Centuries later, this college, Royal College, became a university, as Bologna, as Oxford, etc. And the student and professor of this time said, how could we nickname this university to represent its essence and its substance? And they were trying to find something with Sorbonne. They had difficulties to find, but a Latin scholar said, oh, remember, Sorbona in Latin means good luck, good opportunity. So they decided to call Sorbonne, Sorbona, this university, because it's a good opportunity and a good luck. We should never forget that universities, our schools, should represent this good luck for everyone who can attend a good school, a good university, a good high school. So Sorbona, this is the wishes we make for all our students.
And actually, that's a wonderful segue to ask the next question. To make it relevant and relevant to society, how can we rethink and reimagine education, reimagine the classroom, so that we bring in the sectors, whether it is education, whether it is women's issues, whether it is healthcare? How do we bring the economy? How do we bring that into the classroom? Carole, would you like to comment on that?
Well, maybe we have to take education out of the classroom also, and at the same time maybe bring the community into the classroom. I probably shouldn't say this in this group, but I also think we have to take education away from the educrats, if I may. or not entirely in the control of the educrats. Let me put it that way. I think education leadership is an area that demands much more attention. I don't think we talk about training, but I don't know that we've talked as much about leadership. And I think leadership, all kinds of leadership in education, is an area that needs more attention. So, to me, education should be more of a community endeavor. And if it's a community endeavor, then the ownership of education is a broader ownership. It's the ownership of well, certainly it's the ownership of the parents. It's the ownership of the community of commerce, as the case may be. It's the ownership of improving the well-being of human beings. So there needs to be some core elements clearly in education. You know, we need to be able to read and to speak and to write and do math, but I just think that it just sees education more broadly, and I think if we engage and realize that educators are more than only those who've been trained to provide education, then perhaps we can define a more community-anchored education. And to me, that's where we should be heading. I wanted to say, I wasn't suggesting we didn't need specialists. I think we need specialists. But the specialist engineer of 2011 may be different than the specialist engineer of 2019. I wasn't suggesting that everybody just walks around going anything goes, but the ability to see transformation in the skills within a specialty is, I suppose, what I meant a little bit more about generalists, that there needs to be more flexibility. We're not going to be doing the same thing today. We're not doing the same thing today that we did 20 years ago, frankly, and people don't stay at the same thing, and that's what I meant a little bit more about that. So again, to me, I think we make education more relevant by becoming less standardized and becoming more community-focused.
Excellent. Now, this panel is also fundamentally about how we engage all sectors in the field of education, to pick up further on Carole's point that education is something which has to be owned by the society, owned by the community. And Georges made a comment a moment ago that technology is a tool. Is it truly a tool for collaboration across sectors?
Yeah, it's a tool, but we have to be careful about this tool. And I am finishing to write a paper I spoke to you in Paris 2 weeks ago about the fragility of power. We have to realize now that our young children, and I realize it day after day through my children, using technology are very dependent on technology. And when the computer fails, they are completely lost. They are completely lost. The fragility of power. Remember this novel by Isaac Asimov, where you have astronauts going in the sky for a mission, using tools perfectly, computers, etc., and then to return to Earth, the computer fails. So they don't know how to calculate the trajectory back Earth. And what do they do in the novel? They rediscover science, Newton's laws, infinitesimal calculus, integral calculus. So I think this is the challenge of education today, is learning to learn, learning to unlearn, and learning to keep your mind available to make the necessary efforts at all levels of professions, of citizenship, learning to learn, learning to unlearn, and learning to be critical and to be rediscovering, to have this capacity not to be passive. And technology gives us power, but it gives us a strong fragility. We have to address that, which is so important. And another aspect is that we think that knowledge is available, and it's an illusion. What do we know? What do we retain from school? If I ask you, what do you know about quantum physics? You learn maybe 1 or 2 hours at school, or bioethics, or biochemistry, or genetic manipulation. And people think that they know. Why? Because they think that making this knowledge available on internet, etc., gives this power and this capacity to think that knowledge is acquired. We are in a strong illusion of knowledge, which is far deeper than it was 15 years or centuries ago. because what we think we know is very infinitesimal to the reality of knowledge.
Make a very strong case as well for the balance between generalists and specialists. Well said. Just before we open up to the audience, I want to pose one more question, and this to take the look at the role of education in a slightly different manner, but in a way which I know at least two of our panelists, if not all of you, are passionate about, and that is the issue of gender. In so many ways, we know when we tackle gender, particularly education of women and young girls, we are immediately working in a multidisciplinary way. We are already addressing not only the status of women and legal issues, we're addressing health, we're addressing economics of the household, economics of the community. We are addressing a multitude of issues. How do you look at gender? And perhaps Sir Abed might like to comment on that and the role of how that brings sectors together. And then perhaps Carole and George.
Well, I consider education for girls the most important investment that one could ever make in any society. So that's because it has got multiple outcomes. It's not only just our own understanding of society or our own education, our own rationality, our own creativity going to be affected by education, but it is also affecting our entire families' understanding and creativity also. So the society values education, that it's the mother who should be first educated before anybody else. Then we have seen fantastic changes in children's lives when mothers are educated. One has even gone on calculating the life expectancy at birth of women with 5 years of education, 7 years of education, 9 years of education, and so on. So we can tell you there's fantastic benefits that comes out of women's education in every society. It's not just a developing country, but in developed country also. Yes.
Carole? Yeah, well, I totally agree. If I could do only one thing, it would be to focus on assuring that all girls and therefore all boys are getting a good quality education. Because the returns on investment are just so incredible. But it's becoming a more nuanced issue, it seems to me, and some significant differences between what I would call the industrialized world and the developing world. In the developing world, the gap in terms of girls and boys having access at least to primary school, the issue of quality of education in primary school is still very much at issue. But the access of girls and boys in primary school has just definitely been closing. There is still a gap, but it's closed dramatically. But that is not so in secondary school. I mean, the continuation in secondary school, and we know that these benefits, which you get even from the 5 years, are significant, but they dramatically increase in secondary school. But the other is that this disparity in terms of industrialized and developing, I mean, girls are doing better than boys in most of the industrialized world. That pattern is not showing up even where there's parity in developing countries. And I think I think there's more research that needs to be done there. In large part, it's because while girls are now going to school and they're still doing all the tasks they used to do before. So they're going to school, but they're still going to collect the water. They're still taking care of their siblings. They're still doing other things. So they have less time to do homework. They have less time to do other things. They're more tired. And so it's very interesting that the access gap is closing, but the equity in terms of boys and girls in poorer countries, in terms of their ability to take advantage of education, hasn't closed that much. There's certainly more attention to it, and we can't forget boys. The fact is, certainly in the more industrialized world, the challenge for education of boys and the dropout of boys and those issues are critically important. And even the attitude of boys in developing countries in terms of girls' education are critical. But I think it's become less a access issue and a more nuanced able to take advantage of education and move it forward. And yet again, just to conclude, having spent 7 years as an investment banker, the best investment advice I've ever been able to give is to invest in girls going to school.
Well, I'm into that. Let's open up to the audience, and let me invite questions from our audience. I believe there are two individuals here who are walking with mics, and let's start with the gentleman in the front row. If you just wait for a mic which is coming to you. Please identify yourself, and in the interest of time, keep your question brief. Thank you.
I'm Oscar Becerra from Peru, and I would like your opinion regarding this. It seems that in the last 50 years, what universities have been best at doing is increasing their tuitions. Do you think that's a good way to survival, or what can be done in that area?
Who would like to answer that? George, we're going to turn it to you.
No, the way the question is raised, my answer is no, of course not. As I said, universities should be a Sorbonne, a good luck, a good opportunity with equity of access, you know, respecting also talent, individual talent. It should not uniformize. But for me, access to higher education, not only universities, should be offered to all those who have the capacities for it. And I think this belongs to the social contract between higher education and society. So I think we have now to deconstruct the social contract linking education and society, and to rethink it, to make it more equitable, and to help each one to have this Sorbonne possibility to access for the best of his or her life. And this is very important for me to rethink, because university and education should not, at any price, become a market. When education becomes a market, humanism is in danger, and humanity is in danger.
Let's see. There's a question, right? I'm going to take the gentleman who, right there in the jacket, the linen jacket.
Thank you. As for the question of how education will look in 50 years from now, I'd like to ask whether education itself is a driver of change during the coming 50 years, or is it driven by other drivers of change? That's the first question. The second question has to do with gender, the matter of gender. How can we explain and solve the paradox of the gap between the fact that females actually gain better education and better achievement and remarks in many countries, while their employability is very much lower than males? Thank you.
Thank you. If Sir Abed would answer the first question with regards to what's the driver of change, and maybe Carole, I'll send the second question to you.
I think the drivers of change will obviously, the needs of society will drive change in the requirements of what kind of education we need to provide in order to be able to deal with the issues or problems or situations that is likely to be in the next 50 years. So one can see, for example, in the next 50 years, we will need to solve many kinds of problems like fossil fuel running out, trying to get new kinds of energy, whether it is from waves of the sea or whatever. So we need to develop technologies in this line and develop courses, university courses, which would cater to educating these people, these scientists. I also see the nanotechnology going to become very, very important. We need to also understand the medical sciences for geriatrics, for people living much longer than they are doing now in 50 years. And large numbers of people will be over 70, over 80, and they need to be treated and looked after well. So all kinds of needs of societies will change and will drive the kind of education we need to provide in order to serve that future society.
I'm not sure I entirely understood the question, but I would I think there are a number of factors in play. I suppose the first factor is still, we live in a world where I believe women aren't valued, frankly, still undervalued in terms of what they can contribute to the world. We know that in professions where women start to be in equal numbers or predominate, that generally the compensation for those professions either levels off or sometimes heads down. It doesn't go away, but it's less competitive. We live in a world that hasn't fully taken into account yet, in many different ways, from the poorest to the richest countries, although I think that actually, if we're talking about thinking about the future, that potentially in a world where more traditional forms of work will change, it may be able to take into that account, and that account is the woman as the bearer of children. Not the raiser of children, but the bearer of children. Men and women can raise children and should raise children, but certainly women bearing children and the implications of bearing children. So I think all of those play a role. You know, if you just think a few years ago, we've come an enormous distance. There's still an enormous distance that needs to be closed. But I remain an optimist. I think long ago gave up standing in a corner moaning and weeping that, you know, there was some discrimination out there. I don't think we ignore that there is, but I think we move forward, and I'm generally an optimist in this area. But there are still challenges, and we fool ourselves if we think there aren't challenges.
Something slightly different here. First of all, the gentleman with the linen shirt, if you can bring the mic to him. And there's a gentleman right here in the row, if you can bring the second mic. We're going to, so just be ready with your questions, the gentleman right here. I'm going to pose the next question on Twitter, which has come through, and it's for Professor Haddad. And it says, to the Professor Haddad, I admire your views on education, critical thinking, and creativity. And I absolutely agree, we have to cultivate these mentalities. But how do we go about doing that in school?
This is also a very difficult question. I have written 40 pages on this issue about creativity and critical thinking, so it's very difficult to summarize. I think we have to, first, to rethink the way we teach and we train the teachers, of course. And we have to reevaluate and give more values to the teaching professions, which are so important, because now teachers become more and more the weak elements of society. They feel that they are not respected as they should be. They are sometimes even rejected and by different systems of education, and education becoming a market. In rich families, they have what we call shadow education through private tutorship, which is destroying the role of normal educators. So we have to rethink the way we train the teachers, but also the way we develop curricula. We cannot, as you said, just keep on a discipline in a strict way of a discipline. We have now to open the way. Edgar Morin, for example, address this question of transdisciplinarity and to address the complexity of the teaching. Even in mathematics, if you teach mathematics the way we taught mathematics 20 years ago, you kill the children. Yeah. You create, despair and a real teaching disaster. So we have now to rethink the way we teach, even in our disciplines, and to work together, a mathematician with a biologist, with an economist, with a physicist, with an historian, with a philosopher, and rebuild new curricula which are adapted to the challenges of creativity, which goes beyond the borders, as you said, Carole, which is important. The border of knowledge, of strict knowledge, to go further.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to say that you can, I suppose, teach creativity to some extent in schools and colleges, even in universities, teaching people how to question things and all that. But I always think that creativity in a society, the way it's an incentive system within the broader society that ultimately provides the right kind of opportunity for people becoming creative. I always think of 14th century Florence, Italy, where there are lots of creativity by artists, even jewelers, even people who are men at arms, doing very creative things in a corner of Italy, which is very small. There are lots of creative people. Obviously, the society must have provided the kind of incentives for creative peoples to come out and flourish. And so it's a societal incentive system that needs to be created also in order to get your creative people being identified and provided with the right kind of incentives.
Yeah, may I add something? I forgot I wanted to say. Creativity goes also with confidence. And one question we have to ask to ourselves: does school system develop confidence in the students? We speak of violence at school. I would like also to speak as school violenting students. Notes, exam, evaluation, selection, all this which are necessary sometimes destroys the confidence. And you cannot be creative if you have not this confidence in yourself. So I think school also has to be rethought, to be less violent to children and to students, and to give them the capacity to express what they have in mind. When you teach at university and you feel that your students are afraid and frightened to raise questions, to ask questions, because they are afraid by the evaluation you could and the assessment you could have on them. I think it's a relationship, a new type of relationship, where confidence will be one of the major challenges of the school system. Otherwise, this violence from school to children destroy this creative capacity.
Now I'm going to do something slightly different. The gentleman who is in the linen shirt, we're going to take 3 questions so we can get more of the audience questions in. So the gentleman in the linen shirt, you have the mic. If you just state your question.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Batuhan Aydagül. I am from the Education Reform Initiative in Turkey. It's a non-governmental think and do tank. My question is actually how our panelists, maybe I would like to especially hear Sir Abed and Carole Bellamy's views. How do they see the role and presence of international governmental organizations evolve in education and development, such as the World Bank, all other institutions that have a presence? And how do we manage their conflicting agendas sometimes vis-a-vis what education should look like in the future?
Thank you. Let me take the question of this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Kinga from the Kingdom of Bhutan. I just wanted to make a statement and also ask a question to all the honorable panelists there. Especially Professor Haddad mentioned about the element of being inhuman when you monetize and market the education, I think. I beg to differ there because primarily if you look at the developing countries, there is such a huge gap in terms of access to education. Unless you invite the private sector and some kind of investment in the education sector, I don't think we are going to fill that gap because there are only limited foundations to go around, and there are only limited people like Mr. Fazle to go around who are really committed the entire life with this conviction to really promote education in the poor countries. And then also my question is, of course, there is also the argument that the quality of teachers should be extremely important to churn out good students. And unless you pay well, I don't think we are going to have good quality teachers in general. I mean, I'm not trying to say that this is something general all throughout the world. So my question is, how can we really promote education in developing countries where the gap is so much without inviting private sector participation?
Okay, and the last question is to this gentleman here. If you just stand so the mic can come to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Pierre Goudiaby-Atepa. I'm an architect from Senegal. I just want to make 2 comments. Comment number 1, we're trying to rethink education. I wish in the panel, we have a 30 years old or 25 years old, and ask them, what do they think about the future? You mentioned Twitter. Maybe these are the things that will help our people break the gap. Professor Haddad said that, well, everything is there. I think you said something like, we have everything, but to us, the most important thing is the hardware. You can talk about everything you want. In your populations, maybe 10% of the people have a computer. In ours, I would say less than 1% have a computer. So unless you help us get the computer, the hardware to the kids, once you give it to them, they know what to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to direct the question on the role of international organizations, particularly the World Bank and other institutions like that, to Carole. Sorry.
Well, there are institutions and institutions. How's that for an answer? I think in recent years there's been more attention to understanding that the importance is not to be parachuting in education programs into countries. And I think there is more attention on the part of international organizations to be supportive of the education plans of the countries themselves. Certainly the program I work with does. And hopefully then others will become aligned. Now what international institutions can do is to also provide policy dialogue and technical assistance and capacity building, but not parachute in separate programs. In the long run, the long-term sustainability of education will only develop if it's really out of the education, if it's out of the country themselves, if it's the country's education program. And I think there's more attention to this. And keeping the international organizations on their toes, I think NGOs play a very important role. Both international NGOs, but also indigenous NGOs play a critical role. And I just wanted to say, since us old fogies are up here on the panel, which we are, I'll only speak for myself, don't forget tomorrow afternoon there's a session with the young learners. So then you can ask them these same questions and get totally different answers.
Okay, and the next question to Sir Abed. Should we privatize education? The gentleman from Bhutan said we need to engage the private sector. There are very few of you in the world, and so how do we get more out to
Well, historically, education has been done by churches, and madrasas were created by, so it's religious authorities in countries created education system. So it was not government, it was private churches did it. Then, and then government became involved in education only in the 19th century. 19th, 20th century, government became heavily involved in education. So it's about a couple of 100 years that governments have been involved in education. Previously, it was churches and private. So now, I think the government in most countries are pretty bad at providing quality education. So we need government. We need government because they are taxing our people and creating, can mobilize resources. We need private sector to come up with good quality educational institutions. And we need private sector individuals to also come up with good systems. So I think I don't want to discourage anybody to go into education. As long as you are trying to do a high quality education for your children, this is what we want. So I would advise that it should not be the only purview of government that should provide education. It should be everybody who is interested in the future of their nation should be involved in education. Thank you.
Yeah, when I said I don't want to oppose private and public education. Education benefit to all actors, social actors, companies, etc. What I said is that education should not become purely a market for profit. The only profit is to develop capacity, human capacities and collective capacities for all companies, public and private companies. The only challenge is a challenge of quality. And this is why we have to involve all actors, all partners, all stakeholders to assure quality in education. But we have to be aware that education is becoming more and more a market in many countries, and especially in developing countries.
Thank you so much. I know this has been a fantastic panel, and so before I thank the panel, I just want to mention if you have one last parting words of advice for us, you know, in 5 seconds or less, is there anything you would like to say, Professor Abed? No. You've heard the best. So here you have it. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you to a terrific panel.